this one? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking you for the honor of being able to visit with you a little bit about Leonard's case and about some things that I think are related. I see some wonderful old friends out amongst you, and of course people I haven't met before. Some of you, I guess maybe many of you are students here, which is great, and I appreciate you coming out to hear about something that maybe you only know a little bit about, and hopefully I can help expand some of that knowledge. I want to try and leave time for questions and answers, because that's probably when some of the best stuff may come out. And I didn't hear all the introductions, quite everything that was said. But I guess what I want to do by way of introduction, my name is Bruce Ellison. I'm an attorney. I'm based outside of Rapid City, South Dakota. And one of the things about being an attorney, especially getting involved in cases like Leonard's case, other members of the American Indian movement, as well as various environmental cases, more recently around the KXL pipeline. The plan was to come through South Dakota, and just a brief aside, only in South Dakota could an agency last week approve for construction of that pipeline, which now can't be built anyway. But that's South Dakota. Some eco-terrorism cases, some cases around uranium mining, and a lot of others. But one of the things that it does as a lawyer is it gives me the privilege and the opportunity of kind of being able to look through a window and maybe even step through a door into worlds that at least I would never have had the occasion to do, and I would suggest that probably many of you have not had much experience to do in terms of both the people that have come across and met, the issues that have arisen, and how people and governments have dealt with them, and about documents which can be incredibly revealing. And as an attorney, at least the way that I have always thought of the privilege of being a lawyer, and just to give you an idea for any of you that might be thinking about law school, when I took the entrance exams to go to law school, it was given twice a year, the national exams. And there were over 100,000 people that took each of those exams for a total of 10,000 positions. So one of the things that it said to me was that by being able to be within that 10,000 of the 200,000, and the numbers are much greater now, people who were trying to do that, it really is a privilege. You know, but to me, it's a privilege that comes with responsibility. It's a responsibility to share what I have experienced, to share some of the things that I've learned that I'm still learning. And with regard to things involving protecting the earth, what I want to suggest is we're kind of running out of time. And you know, I want to talk a bit about the price of resistance in terms of the people who raise issues about justice and treaties and decent medical care, the right to live in a home that's decent, the right to have good education for children, and the sacrifice that's involved. And those of you that are even a bit familiar with Leonard Peltier's case, you know that he's serving 2 consecutive life sentences. I also want to make note that, you know, one of the things about coming to Oregon, I have a lot of wonderful memories of Oregon. I've done 3 murder cases here, and an eco-terrorism case in Portland, and have friends in different places of the state. And Oregon is a state that more of you get it in terms of the need to protect the earth and the immediate need to protect the earth than a lot of people in other parts of the country. And certainly in South Dakota. So it's almost wonderful being able to talk about some of the things that I'm going to talk about with you folks and what you've been all about and shown. And one of the things I also want to mention here is you're the home here of the Civil Liberties Defense Center. Leonard Reagan is in the back, director of that center. And Lauren and I have done some work together, and hopefully we're doing work in the future together, because it's about protecting the earth, which means in some ways really protecting everything. I want to just kind of give you a little bit of information about, kind of to have you come with me as I kind of got involved in the struggles, so that we can come to the same place and be talking about some of these same things. I mean, when I went to school, I was taught that our country was found, we had this Constitution, and that we had the Bill of Rights, and that we were a country of laws, and that we had a democracy that actually was ostensibly functioning in the way democracies are supposed to, which is that people really know what's going on, that information is provided in a neutral, in an honest, in a as complete a way as possible, so that we can help those that in fact are supposed to be making decisions to make the right decisions. And then I learned that the United States was set up, and that the people who ran the government, you had to be a white man with property, and that red and black peoples were not even considered to be human beings. And I began to understand about a lot more that that the illusion was a lot different from the reality. And what I want to talk about is at least some of the reality as I've seen it. Other people have perhaps seen some of those realities a little bit differently, but one of the things that I came to understand was how Indian community, Indian people, and various Indian nations within the borders of the United States, well up into the late 1800s at the very least, were the branch of government that dealt with them was the War Department. And then at some point, Indian people began being treated like property, and instead of being the War Department, U.S. government dealings with the Indian community went through the Department of Interior. Like lands, like wetlands, like forests, like. And in some ways that's, I think, a good analogy. But the property part, I think, raised a lot of its own problems. One of the things that I learned as a lawyer is that in Article 6 of the United States Constitution, treaties between the United States and indigenous nations in this country are the supreme law of the land. That means they're the highest of our laws. They are supposed to mean more than other lesser things. But then I learned that the United States will enter into various treaties with other nations only to be willing to violate them when it seems in the interest of the United States. And usually that interest, I would suggest, is corporate, is financial. If it wasn't for land and resources, I would suspect this would still be all Indian country. Because, like most wars, they're about land and resources. So not only were there rampant treaty violations as resources were discovered, such as in the Black Hills where I live, where a lot of what I'm going to be talking about occurred. 1868, the United States government having been defeated time and time again, the military by Lakota, by Nakota, Dakota, by Arapaho, by Cheyenne forces, who were just defending their homelands, entered into a treaty of peace, 1868. But then 6 years later, Custer came through with the 7th Cavalry, and gold was discovered in the Black Hills. And suddenly everything changed. Suddenly everything was never going to be the same for the peoples of that particular area. And what began was really efforts at extermination. You know, the buffalo were wiped out. The source of people's ability to sustain themselves was intentionally eliminated, and people were driven into smaller and smaller areas of land. But again, you know, the difference between the illusions of what America is all about and the realities of it. And, you know, for example, I mentioned this last night, people were there. Sometimes I find that different musicians, artists, they have come out with phraseology that is really to the point. You know, we like to think of ourselves as a democracy where we can, you know, the Constitution says we have freedom of speech, freedom of the right to associate, seek redress of grievances. You wouldn't know that from the way the government deals with dissent these days, but that's what we've got. And there's a group that some of you may know of, and it may date me a little bit, but there was a group called the Neville Brothers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with their work, but in one of their songs they talk about freedom of speech as long as you don't say too much. And that really is America. Now, when I went out to South Dakota, I went out there straight out of law school. I'd been working with some folks in New York, where my law school was, who were trying to set up the International Indian Treaty Council. It became the second NGO at the United Nations after the Palestine Liberation Organization. And those folks asked me at some point, because I was in my last year of law school, if I would consider going out to South Dakota as a staff attorney with the Wounded Knee Defense Committee. And I'd already had some experiences, though, that made me really wonder about the basic things that I had been taught in school about what our country was about. And one of them was having experience while I was in law school, was working with the American Civil Liberties Union and their, what they call their secrecy project. And we worked particularly on a case out of Kent State. And some of you maybe have heard of Kent State before. You know, on May 4th, 1969, the National Guard, Ohio National Guard, opened up on protesting students and killed 4 and wounded 12. And then a few days later, there was the Mississippi State Police opened up on black students with machine guns and killed 2 people. And for me, that was the beginning of something that was very real and concrete, that was a lot different from my understanding about the way America was supposed to be dealing with dissent. But one of these matters that I got involved in involved Kent State had to do with the infiltration of a political organization by government agents. And the organization was Vietnam Vets Against the War. And the United States infiltrators were the ones who started advocating violence. They were the ones who started providing weapons. They started talking about how the vets should go and start killing cops. And I say this because some of this stuff may seem familiar to some of the things that you've been hearing on the news lately. But it was my first beginnings of an understanding of how the United States government and its intelligence forces were really one large criminal conspiracy. And in some instances, actually a terrorist conspiracy. So I went out to South Dakota as an attorney fresh out of law school to practice law, and found that I was in the middle of a war zone. That was very different from anything I'd ever experienced before. But I found that there was this organization called the American Indian Movement. And AIM, even as the FBI would acknowledge in its documents, was an organization that supported seeking the upholding of treaty rights, people's civil rights, people's human rights. You know, as I said, it's just the basics. Decent place to live and raise kids and educate kids and have a place where there would be a future that would be determined by the community, by the families, by the heads of the families. And what I found instead was that the United States was arming and equipping and providing intelligence information to a group that called itself the Goon Squad, Guardians of the Law Nation. And these folks actually waged terrorism with impunity throughout the Pine Ridge Reservation in the years that led up to and certainly followed the Wounded Knee Siege in 1973 that many of you may have heard about. This terrorism left scores of people dead, many people maimed physically and psychologically, just terrorized the community. And the thing that was so interesting, and maybe now I'm going to try and draw some of these dots that I've thrown out at you. Leonard Peltier was convicted of killing 2 FBI agents in a firefight that occurred on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation near the community of Ogallala. In the months prior to the government's paramilitary assault on that community, of which Leonard and others tried to defend, the government labeled the American Indian Movement as one of the most dangerous organizations in the country. And one of the things that it noted in making this designation was it talked about that there was a shift in AIM's emphasis. And the shift in AIM's emphasis, at least as the FBI understood it, was going to be that AIM was going to be turning a lot of its attention towards stopping mining activities that destroyed the earth. And that really became what the threat was about. What we later found out was in the area of the Black Hills, where a lot of AIM activity was centered, some 23 multinational corporations had come in at the same time and were basically getting leases and claims for uranium and the other minerals that are in the particular area. We're still dealing with uranium mining issues even today. And they felt threatened by the presence of AIM. And especially once this change of emphasis, at least as the FBI was considering it, had occurred, it became a big threat. And when I will mention one of the things about uranium mining that a lot of people don't understand in the discussions about nuclear power is there's a lot of problems with the end of this fuel cycle. Uranium mining is incredibly destructive to the earth at the front end of the fuel cycle. Uranium is generally found in water supplies. In the Black Hills, it's found in one of our 4 major water supplies. It always contaminates water. And they're finding more and more about how, in fact, destructive this can be. So 23 multinational corporations were coming into the area, and scientists were referring to the Black Hills area as a national sacrifice area. The treaties, the Laramie Treaty of 1868, which I talked a little bit about before, that begins on the western shore of the Missouri and goes halfway through the Black Hills and halfway into Wyoming and to parts of Nebraska as well. Well, the National Science Foundation said that you could start at the western side of the Missouri River and mine all the way to the big ones and take everything. It's about money. The problem was the people were in the way. The problem was this was a sacred area to people. And so one of the things you have to do if you're going to get at the land where people are and people worship, you have to separate that worship and the people from the land. So the traditional religions were outlawed in the late 1800s. Same time as Custer's coming through. Same time as the mining starts going. Some of you may know the Homestake Mine in the northern Black Hills is how the Hearst Empire started. It's also how it had its roots in the creation of what I call the organized crime of the state of South Dakota. Our state government essentially operates in that particular fashion. So the Boone Squad is operating on the reservation, basically terrorizing communities because the communities are supporting what AIM is trying to do. And in that terrorization, though, people felt that they had no law enforcement agencies they could turn to, despite the jurisdictions that were involved. And so there was an effort to call in people for help. And amongst those people who came were a group that was referred to as the Northwest Group. And it included Leonard Peltier, Dino Butler, Bob Robidoux, Neelak Butler, quite a number of other folks who, at the request of the chiefs and headsmen of the Pine Ridge Reservation, came into the Pine Ridge Reservation to serve as a defense element. one of the things that that I learned from this group of individuals is a very different idea of leadership, which I think really, and I would encourage strongly, is something that I would encourage people to think about in terms of what leadership really is. It wasn't a bunch of people who were standing in front of TV cameras talking about how great they were. It was, you know, when somebody's car needed to get fixed, Leonard would go fix it. When somebody's roof was leaking, people from the group would go and fix the roof. There were homes that didn't have running water, so people, and elders especially, so the people in the group would go and they would get water. They would do what was necessary to show by example about people helping each other, especially helping the elderly and certainly helping the young. And what we didn't know at that time was, although it was suspected, was that the government's response was, in fact, domestic security operations. Domestic security operations that were designed to infiltrate, disrupt, destroy the American Indian movement, including the support for the American Indian movement. And these domestic security operations took a variety of forms. One of those forms was, as I said, the Goon Squad. And the terrorism that, and I will say quite clearly that it was terrorism, when people who are the children or cousins or nephews of members of the American Indian movement are standing in the front of their homes outside and are shot down by snipers. That's terrorism. When goons would drive through the circular housing on the reservation, peppering the walls of homes with automatic and semi-automatic weapons fire, that's terrorism. When people could not walk down the street alone because they might be subjected, if they were men, to gang beatings and if they were women, to gang rapes, that's, to me, is terrorism. Occasionally, the government would prosecute somebody, but usually it was pretty minimal. Usually investigations were designed to produce a result if the goon was charged to be acquitted. Where what the judges would allow would be that the victims became the targets of the prosecution as well as the defense, and matters were turned around. So Leonard came into the community, and I think it's important that we look at some of the things that were going on leading up to the firefight that occurred on June 26th of that particular year. In the early part of that year, the government started looking for Leonard around the country. The FBI documents talk about how every time there was an AIM activity, there was Leonard Peltier. So, political reasons. They were using what they called in the documents their security or their extremist informants to hunt for Leonard. And then about 2 months later, about 2 months before the firefight, the FBI issued a position paper the likes of which I have never seen since. It was called FBI Paramilitary Operations in Indian Country. And it was essentially how the FBI was going to deal with AIM as a paramilitary, as a counterinsurgency, rather than just a counterintelligence or disruptive activities. 3 weeks before the firefight, about a month before the firefight, the FBI brought in quite a number of agents from various divisions from around the country. These agents were SWAT team members. So suddenly you had goon squad terrorism going on, you suddenly had influx of FBI SWAT teams. And 3 weeks before the firefight, FBI inspectors from Washington, D.C. came out and given a tour of the Pine Ridge Reservation. And there was an area near Oglala at the Jumping Bull Ranch that was pointed out to them, and they were told that this was an AIM stronghold. They were told that there were bunkers there, which turned out to be pretty decrepit root cellars. But this is what they were told. And they were told, and the FBI started talking internally about how this area would need paramilitary forces in order to take it. And 3 weeks later, there was a paramilitary assault on the Jumping Bull Ranch. There was a paramilitary assault which resulted in the deaths of 3 people, 2 FBI agents and an A member. And the thing I want to suggest to you about the way that the quote-unquote sides look at this is, this has always been a day for the government, particularly the FBI, in which 2 innocent FBI agents were ambushed and murdered. For Leonard, for the people in the Northwest group, it was from that day, a day in which 3 human beings died. And I would suggest to you that just the difference in that perspective really says so much about the perspectives of the interests that were being dealt with, which were occurring during that time period. When the government decided that, and found out that the agents were dead, they decided they wanted to assault the residences. And again, to give you an idea of the mentality, the people that we're dealing with, when they assaulted those homes, their best intelligence information up to date was that those homes were filled with women and children. And yet when they assaulted those homes, fortunately there was no one that was in them. And I'll give you a description of at least what I saw in terms of the aftermath. There was one of the houses was a small greenhouse. It was where the Jumping Bull's grandson, his wife, and their very young children lived. And in fact, what they knew of the firefight was all of a sudden bullets started coming through the walls of their house, and they looked out and they saw these 2 guys down behind 2 cars down in the bowl that was about 100 yards from the residences, firing in their direction. Well, when I saw this house, not only was it riddled with bullets, and agents described when they assaulted this empty house, how they emptied clip after clip of M16 rounds into these homes, this home in particular. When I walked in and I found a doll, a young female doll in the house. It had a bullet hole in each breast, a bullet hole in the pubic area, and a bullet hole in the head. Again, the mentality of the people that people were forced to deal with. There's a 8th Circuit judge by the name of Gerald Heaney. Gerald Heaney said that after Wounded Knee, that rather than respond to the legitimate grievances, his words, of the Indian community with reason, that instead the United States used military force. And Judge Heaney, in this letter in which he recommended to President Clinton that Leonard Peltier be granted clemency, said that the FBI was at least equally responsible for what happened that particular day, and that time for healing and that executive clemency would be appropriate for Leonard. But what we know is that when that firefight happened, that same day, instead of the criminal investigation that the FBI generally launches, with the head of the division being in charge of that criminal investigation, it was immediately taken from the criminal investigation division and put under the command and control of the head of the security section, domestic security section of the FBI. So the criminal investigation of the deaths of the agents became folded into a domestic security operation, a series of operations that were really designed to destroy Maine. And that's, I think, important because it creates an agenda. It creates an agenda that is not driven by facts. It creates an agenda that's driven by goals, in this case, of targeting people. For Leonard Peltier, what this meant was about 2.5 weeks after the firefight, the FBI decided that Leonard Peltier killed the agents. And they gave us the basis for this, that in an encampment where people were staying about 1/3 of a mile away from the Jumping Bull residences, that Leonard Peltier's fingerprints were found in some of the items in the camp. Yeah, with about 350 other people's. And there was a BIA police officer who claimed that he looked through a 7-power scope rifle at a distance of 600 yards and was able to positively identify Leonard running from the residences. Even if that was true, how does that say he killed the agents? That and his fingerprints being found on vehicles or boxes or papers. But it was a start for them. It was they had targeted Leonard and then off it went. Now, at some point, 4 people were charged. Leonard was charged, Dino Butler was charged, Bob Robin was charged, and Jimmy Eagle was charged. And to some extent, this created we got the people who did it, they said. But it created an interesting dynamic for them because all of the radio traffic of the agents who were killed talked about the agents having spotted Jimmy Eagle, or some of them talked about spotting Jimmy Eagle and following a red pickup. And that's what they were chasing. The problem was Leonard wasn't in that picture, and Leonard had no connection to a red pickup. But they didn't worry about that at that point. That some of that stuff came later. Of the 4, Leonard fought extradition from Canada, as many of you may know. And one of the things that was involved in the government's efforts to extradite him was they needed a witness, an eyewitness. Some of you may know, you study the history of the Uranium movement and what was going on during that time period, that a couple of years before, AIM leaders Dennis Banks and Russell Means were tried for wounded knee charges in Minnesota. And the government had a problem there too. They had charged all these felonies, they just didn't have anybody who saw either of these men committing any of these felonies. So they found a young man by the name of Louis Mooskamp and an agent by the name of David Price and an agent by the name of Ron Williams, who later died on the battlefield at the Jumping Bulls. Worked on Louis Mooskamp. And they got this young man to the point that he was, in fact, an eyewitness and filled in every gap in the evidence that the government needed. There were a couple of issues that then arose around Louis Mooskamp. One day he got drunk, left the custody of the 2 agents, Price and Williams, and raped a 16-year-old girl. The FBI made sure that Louis Mooskamp was never even charged for that rape. But that eventually came out, and that was something that disturbed the trial judge. What was most disturbing to the trial judge was the fact when a press conference videotape surfaced that on the dates that Louis Mooskamp was testifying he was in Wounded Knee in South Dakota and witnessing Means and Banks doing all these felonious acts, that in fact he was doing press conferences in California. Well, for Leonard, they needed somewhat of the same thing. And they found a young woman by the name of Myrtle Pourbear. Myrtle Pourbear lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation, as did Louis Mooskamp. And again, David Price was there because he had lost his partner, Ron Williams, that previous summer. Louis had a new partner that was just as bad. And suddenly Myrtle Pourbear, much to the surprise of Leonard's actual girlfriend, was filling out affidavits. She had been Leonard's girlfriend for a while. And what was submitted in the extradition was that she was standing next to Leonard when Leonard shot and killed both agents. And I got a second affidavit which just fleshed it out a little bit more, but essentially said the same thing. What they did not present to the judiciary up in Canada to extradite Leonard was a third affidavit, which was really the first affidavit that the FBI had Pourbear sign. And that one, instead of saying, I was standing next to Leonard Peltier when he shot and killed the agents, that sentence wasn't there. There was a sentence, I left the day before the firefight, and Leonard Peltier later confessed to me that he had killed the agents. A federal judge in the United States would later say that this represented a good example for people who were raising questions that if the government was willing to fabricate evidence to bring Leonard Peltier back into the United States, that any evidence they might present in the United States might be fabricated just as well. You know, before Leonard went to trial, Darrell Butler and Bob Robert went to trial, Cedar Rapids, and started talking about that. The government's theory during that trial was that Leonard and Dino and Bob, acting in concert, had participated in the firefight that resulted in the deaths of the agents. They called that aiding and abetting. That judge that we had in Iowa, a very conservative place, and this I also want to mention because, you know, as I said, Earth is in jeopardy. We don't really have a lot of time, and we need to open up the eyes and the minds of many people who can hopefully save this place for our grandchildren. But there was a judge there who, very conservative judge, you know, basic American upbringing in terms of believing in law and believing in the Constitution, but he was willing to keep his eyes open. He was willing to learn about things that he didn't even want to learn. And in the process, what he did in that trial was he allowed for, since the government was charging aiding and abetting, he allowed for the defense to put on residents from Pine Ridge who talked about the climate of fear and terror on the reservation. We were able to put on a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights investigator who corroborated that, and other witnesses and other evidence, to the point that when that trial ended, the jury found these two men not guilty. And the jury foreman said in that case that had Leonard been tried with Darrell Butler and Bob Robert, he would have been acquitted too. But approximately a month after the acquittals, and leave it to be said that the FBI was unhappy with the verdict. There was a meeting in Washington, D.C. at FBI headquarters. Prosecutors, FBI legal division, director, and they decided that they couldn't prosecute Jimmy Eagle and prosecute Leonard Peltier. So they decided to dismiss the charges against Jimmy Eagle, and in their words, put the full prosecutive weight of the federal government against Leonard Peltier. And suddenly, a van that Leonard sometimes would drive became a red pickup. And a rifle that had been previously eliminated from having fired any ammunition at the Jumping Bull compound during the firefight, suddenly there was a match to shell casings. The government was very good about creating climates of fear and terror on the reservation. Like the jury foreman in the Butler Avenue case, that was their conclusion, that the FBI was responsible for the climate of fear and terror on Pine Ridge. Well, the FBI wasn't going to allow that to happen for Leonard. Suddenly we got a new judge. We still don't understand how. It was just this sudden administrative transfer away from the chief judge in the Northern District of Iowa, who he thought was going to be trying the case. We got shifted up to a judge up in North Dakota, a man who never believed that the FBI ever did anything wrong. And we know that there were a series of meetings between the judge and the FBI. The FBI accused Leonard's defense team of that we were supposed to have sophisticated electronic equipment and were bugging the judge's chambers, the jury room, and the FBI buildings. And so they wanted the judge's authority to basically do an electronic sweep of the whole building. And we figured that's when they planted the bugs in the jury room, because they seemed to know the verdict before the jury came out of the jury room. But it had an effect on the judge. Because basically they were trying to say, Judge, you know, these attorneys, they're as big criminals as Peltier and his associates are here. And then suddenly the 2.5-week defense that we were able to put on in Cedar Rapids was reduced to about a day and a half. All of the evidence that resulted in the jury finding that that Darrell Butler, Bob Robidoux, and Leonard had acted in self-defense was not allowed in Leonard's trial. And Leonard was convicted and given 2 consecutive life sentences. What we know about some of the evidence that got revealed during the trial, we hear a lot about renditions these days, that CIA does or contractors do. Government picked up a bunch of teenagers who had been present at the jumping bulls. 15 years old, they were interrogated without attorneys. One young man, his mother was there. She was told she would never see her son again. All the 15-year-olds were told that they would never walk the earth again, free. One young man was interrogated by a process where they would question him for an hour, put him back in his cell for an hour, question him for an hour, put him back in his cell for an hour. They did this over a 24-hour period. When he still wouldn't give them the answers that they wanted, they tied him to a chair and threatened to beat him unless he did. Now, so one of the things that this produced was during the trial, the government had this problem. They wanted to have a van linked to Leonard as coming into the jumping bull compound, followed by the agents. Well, this young man gets on the witness stand, and instead of being in the camp and running up to the residences and the agents coming in from a different direction, he's suddenly on top of one of the residences when it comes to his trial testimony. And he says he saw Leonard Peltier driving a orange pickup into the jumping bull property. And the prosecutor says to him, now, when you say orange pickup, you mean a red and white van, right? And he said, yes. Outrageous. Outrageous kind of stuff. But Leonard was convicted. After his conviction, he was convicted of being the one who actually pulled the trigger and shot the agents. After his conviction under the Free Information Act, we received proof from the FBI lab that the weapon that the government told the jury Leonard used to kill the agents and match the shell casing found right near the bodies, in fact, had been tested and could not, as I mentioned earlier, could not have fired any of the cases that they found at the scene. Now, there was U.S. Supreme Court had a standard at that time, and they said if the government withheld evidence from the defense that went to the key evidence in the case and said that that key evidence was a fraud, you get in trial. That's still the standard today. It's called the United States versus Bagley. In order to affirm Leonard's conviction, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said, well, yes, this does go to the key evidence. It goes to the heart of the case. Yes, it possibly would have resulted in an acquittal, but no, we're not going to grant the trial. And basically what that seemed to say was the government can target a person for political reasons, fabricate the evidence to be used to convict them, hide evidence of that fabrication, and even if that evidence later surfaces, if you're Leonard Peltier or some other one who is being treated the same way, you cannot get a new trial. And I say that because, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of protecting our Earth. And just like the American Indian movement became the biggest threat when it started talking about protecting the Earth, we have to remember that this is the kind of a government that we're dealing with. We have to remember that our court system is an American governmental court system. And from my experience, plays politics. The decision to affirm Leonard's conviction based upon that evidence, and there have been people freed before that and after that with less direct evidence of innocence. They got new trials, and Leonard did not. They were supposed to be a country of laws, but really we're a country of politicians. Most of these judges all these judges, federal judges, in fact, are political appointees. If you steal something, you get fired. Trample on somebody's personal constitutional rights, you still get your, go on, wear your robes and are in there the next day. But it's what makes Leonard's situation be in all reality that he is in fact a political prisoner in the United States. And we have to understand that there are political prisoners in the United States. When people are put in prison because of their political work and not for any acts that they did of a criminal nature, at the very least, one would have to characterize them as a political prisoner. In 1980, some 16 Congress members who were outraged by what they were learning about what had happened on Pine Ridge, and particularly to Leonard Peltier and the fraud of his conviction, wrote a letter to then President Carter seeking clemency for Leonard. To the best of our knowledge, it was never responded to, it was never denied, it was never even acknowledged that it was received. And some of you may know that in 1999-2000, there was a very, very serious effort to get Leonard clemency. And from some sources, I learned that it was successful to the point that the prosecutors who prosecuted Leonard were told that Clinton was going to grant clemency. I was at the White House a week and a half before Clinton left office. We had some very interesting meetings. And in fact, we were told to draft a series of bullet points so the president would explain why he was granting clemency. The next week, the last week before Clinton left office, on the Wednesday before the Saturday he left office, Clinton's lawyers met with the Justice Department. The whole purpose of that meeting that day was whether Clinton was going to get indicted for the perjuries that he had committed in front of the grand jury the summer before that was investigating his affair with Monica Lewinsky and with some of the corruption around the Whitewater properties. Our sources, and they were good sources, told us that Leonard's name came up 4 times during that day during the discussions. And I've been in some of those meetings. There, but I've been in similar type meetings, and basically, it's pretty easy. Well, look, Mr. President, you can on Monday you can be appearing in front of a U.S. magistrate and arguing why you should be released on conditions for your federal perjury charges. If you grant clemency, or you could do nothing and go out and make your millions, and we know which one he chose. One of the things that happened during that period of time was some things of interest. We had been trying to debate the FBI about what had happened on Pine Ridge for a long time. We'd been trying to get a congressional investigation into what had gone on for a long time. U.S. Commission on Civil Rights recommended a full-scale investigation by Congress in terms of what the FBI had done in connection with destroying what the American Indian movement. There was a lot of support for clemency from national and international figures and many, many, many thousands and thousands of people writing letters. It was also a time where 500 FBI agents demonstrated in front of the White House. They all said they were off duty, came from all over the country and whatnot. And this struck me as rather interesting because I did a little history checking and found out that the only previous time that there were ever armed people outside of the White House making demands was back in the War of 1812 when it was the British. So the fact that the FBI would go to those lengths would certainly be extreme. And they all worried. They made sure those congressional hearings never happened. There was a lot of serious proof of what had gone on that would open up what our domestic security apparatus really is all about. And still to this day, they refuse to go anywhere near it. So we're going to try again. We have a clemency petition. It is almost finished. It's going to be filed. This is Leonard's last chance. You know, we tried to bring various legal proceedings to get him relief in trials, situations around his parole, his release, and basically 3 courts of appeals, different parts of the country, have now said, don't come back to us. Leonard, we don't want to hear anything that you want to present to us. You're done. So this really is Leonard's only legal option, is this clemency. And he has an abdominal aneurysm, which has been discovered. And he needs surgery very quickly. And it would be good if he could go back to the Mayo Clinic, which is a Rochester Medical Facility, which helped treat his jaw, which had been badly botched by previous surgeries. So that's one of the things that we want to try and do, is to get him to a place like the Mayo Clinic so he can be properly cared for. And the other thing, we need to get this man out. I mean, he's been in now for over 40 years for something that he did not do. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that are keeping him in. In 1987, Congress abolished the parole system. You know, we don't kind of think of when you go to prison, you have parole and whatnot. They abolished that for federal prisoners. But for people who were convicted and sentenced before 1987, they still would be in front of a parole board with a dwindling number of prisoners that they would be dealing with. At the time that this change happened, the parole board for the Bureau of Prisons decided that Leonard's release date was going to be 2013, 3 years ago. And then there was a very interesting memo that we found in the Leonard's parole papers. Leonard keeps coming up with all of these very unique things that they seem to happen to somebody, and it seems to be him. There'd been a big dispute that we'd been able to create within the parole apparatus, because first the FBI said, well, Leonard was a shooter, and then we presented the evidence that even the government admitted that they didn't know who shot the agents, couldn't prove that Leonard did it. So then the argument became aiding and abetting. Well, he was an aider and abetting. And then that kind of got shot down when it was understood that, well, he was never able to put on a defense like his co-defendants were, who were acquitted of aiding and abetting. And then the parole board said, we don't care. And basically what they said, and again, an interesting language, this parole board document that says that it's, you know, regardless of what Leonard did or didn't do, it was clear that someone, as described as from the Native American nation, was involved in killing the agents. And we got one, and we're going to keep him. You know, that was really, that's about as blatant as one can think. And Leonard's parole release date changed from 2013 to 2042. And he still has not been able to get a hearing, to set a hearing, to establish his parole release date. So this clemency is really important. It really is. And it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take, you know, I've been involved in a lot of different things, and I've had times where I've said, oh, write a letter, God, what a waste of time. You know, now send an email, oh, what a waste of time. But it would not be. For those of you who understand social media, probably like my kids and my grandkids do, but I don't. You know how to use social media to get word out and to get things done. I would really like to strongly encourage you that if you think it's right that Leonard Peltier, who is in very bad physical health, man needs to get home. You know, one of the things I want to suggest to you is you look at some of these paintings of this man. To me, an artist is someone, when they do a painting, it's like part of their spirit, part of their soul comes out and ends up on a canvas or whatever medium it might end up being. this very creative, this very talented, this very caring human being needs to go. And it cannot be underestimated that if those of you folks, I keep hearing all these stories about how somebody can start something on Facebook and in a very short period of time there's thousands and thousands and thousands of things that can come out of a post. So if each one of you did that, how many posts do you think you could get? See, asking people to individually send emails to the White House, urging President Obama to grant clemency. And if you're like me and you're still trying to figure out how to even send an email, you can write a letter, send a postcard. You know, don't just call. Some people say, well, I'll call. Okay. No, send something in writing. Don't do mass petitions. Send a lot of individual ones. Because a stack this big of individual petitions is a lot better than a stack that big with 20 signatures on a page. It just has, it's more, it's bigger, it weighs more. It then has more of a potential impact. The things that happened years ago that put Leonard Peltier in prison, because of the way the government was dealing with dissent, it's very important for us to understand, I would suggest to you, that that was the beginnings of what we have today. You know, I said, before, that quote from the Neville Brothers, right? Freedom of speech as long as you don't say too much. Okay, well, there are people in this room who understand that if you question, if you challenge anything that any corporation is doing in your community, anything that your local government, your state government, federal government is doing in your community, that you will be on a list. I didn't go terrorism case here. I got to see how the Joint Terrorism Task Force works here. You engage in any peaceful protest. You engage in the height of nonviolent civil dissent, and you go on a list. And why is our government collecting these lists? And this is not a myth, this is real. Every federal district is broken down and has Joint Terrorism Task Force and now fusion centers. And I'm sure there's new acronyms and names being created every day for what they want to do. And it's not about stopping somebody coming over from Syria. It's about us. You know, in 2001, when the World Trade Center went down, where was the focus of the FBI? Didn't seem to care about Al-Qaeda. They were concerned about the Earth Liberation Front. They were concerned about Earth First. They were concerned about the Animal Liberation Front. They were concerned about some of the indigenous efforts that were going on within the United States. It's about us, and this has always been about us. The United States started war games back 30, 40 years ago of how they were going to deal with dissent. For the people of Pine Ridge, it meant terrorism. It meant use of the criminal justice system for political purposes. There are people here, you know, people who are angry, they're frustrated, right? What do we do against these corporations that want to come in and take control of our communities with total disregard for the water that our kids are going to be able to drink? Look at Flint, Michigan. Right? Sometimes I think that, I don't think a lot of what China's doing is really good, but I do like the idea that if this had been China, the governor and the manager of Flint, Michigan would be in prison right now. And so would all the bureaucrats who had made the decision that it was cheaper to let people be poisoned than it was to give them good quality drinking water. They don't care about us. They care about their profits. They care about preventing anything which interferes with those profits. And again, to tie you in a little bit with some of the things that I've learned, you know, I mentioned these 23 multinational corporations coming to the Black Hills around the same time that the government was going after AIM. after, by the late 70s, when the mining companies were still there trying to mine, at that point, we had an informant in one of the local corporate headquarters who overheard a conversation which he relayed to me, in which what he overheard was, well, we thought once we dealt with those AIM people, we wouldn't have any problems anymore. Because what had come out of that was a coalition of the red and white communities which put a stop to that uranium mining. That coalition of the red and white communities put a stop to Honeywell testing nuclear depleted uranium artillery shells in the southern Black Hills, and that became a wildlife sanctuary. It stopped a million-acre feet of water being taken from the Missouri River that would otherwise be used by all living things in the area from being shipped down south as part of a coal slurry operation. And at least in the immediate sense, it stopped the KXL pipeline, and it stopped uranium mining in the Black Hills. And one of the things I want to suggest, though, is that I really want to encourage you, as you try and figure out what you want to do with your lives, that you really put as in, if you hope to ever have children, if you hope to ever have grandchildren, in the world that you want to see them living in, do you want them to have a world that's got water? Because remember, the only water on this planet that is here now is the only water we're ever going to get. Water may change in a lot of different forms, but this is what we got 1.5 billion years ago. This is all we're going to ever have. If we contaminate it, if we don't care what it does to living things, what is that going to do to our future generations? And they understand. And the people who think and operate by greed rather than their minds, I don't know what they're thinking of for their grandkids. What kind of world do they expect their grandkids are going to be living in? So if this is going to be resistant, if you decide that what you want to do is you want to put at least a part of your life, because there's some people say, well, you got to put all your life, you got to put 100%. No. You put in whatever you can in terms of your time, whatever you think you can at any given moment, and that's going to change. But understand that the struggle that you would be getting involved in not only is the one that needs to happen so that this planet has a future. I certainly want one for my grandkids. But it's also going to be, it's real. These people will do anything to make their money. And they care virtually nothing about life. And they care nothing about justice. And the part about Leonard Peltier's case that's so important for all of us to remember is it could happen to any one of us if they don't like what you're doing. I don't say that to frighten you. I say that because you got to understand that this is real. This is not a fancy, this is not something that you do because it makes you feel good. And when you figure out what needs to get done, what you can do as an individual or with your family or with your neighbors or your friends or people in the community to resist. Remember what can happen. Remember that this is all real, but the consequences if you don't are real too. And as you decide what may be good to be as a tactic, remember this is not about just venting. It's not about just being angry. A lot of mistakes we've made over the decades because people would be so angry and so frustrated, so they would basically go and just vent that anger. But we need to figure out a way that we can bring all of the people together, because if this is going to be a planet where all of us are going to have a future, it has to be harmonious. And I'm not just doing touchy-feely stuff. What I'm saying is that it's going to take people in every part of the community to save our planet and to have this future for our grandkids. The thing that the government is most afraid about, and when they were starting to call AIM one of the most dangerous organizations in the country, was when they started to also be documenting about how AIM people were working with the Black Panthers, with white groups. It's the coalitions that they are really afraid of, because through division they can control us. And to give you an idea of where we're at today, because again, we're still talking about what Leonard and the folks were there for, to protect that particular area. A couple things have happened. Bill Clinton, remember the big liberal Democrat, in 1995 introduced the Patriot Act into Congress. Half of it passed. The other half was rejected by the all-Republican Senate and House, as they said, hey, this would be a police state. So then after 2001, when the right fear word had occurred, the Patriot Act got passed. What the Patriot Act did was it made dissent a crime. It made civil disobedience a crime. So Occupy Wall Street becomes low-grade terrorism. The Indian and non-Indian communities in South Dakota bringing in action in front of the Public Utilities Commission challenging the Trans-Canada, the KXL pipeline, becomes low-grade terrorism. We found out last year that in South Dakota, there was $1 million that was given to our state Homeland Security. 1/3 of it was to deal with people fighting the KXL pipeline. 1/3 of it was to deal with people who were struggling to save water from uranium mining. And the other third was to go to what they called white militia groups. I figured that was to arm and equip them. You know, when we talk about the Goon Squad and the acts of impunity, it's important lessons because the militias are flourishing everywhere. You know what happens going on in Burns, right? Okay? As soon as those folks went into Burns, they weren't immediately surrounded by tanks and armored personnel carriers and had heavy weapon fire directed at them. No, they had quite a different kind of reception. Until they pushed things perhaps a bit last night, but maybe, you know, I don't know, still a lot of dust to be settled about that. But one of the things to give you an idea of then what happens, because the government will try and influence communities. Last year, Homeland Security set up 5 drills in 5 school districts in western South Dakota. The drills were that anti-uranium and anti-KXL activists took over an elementary school and threatened to blow it up unless those projects were stopped. Now we wondered what kind of message they were trying to deliver to the kids and the parents of those kids in the community. But the community pushed back and it actually flipped around on them. But that's a community that's been working and struggling with each other and around many things to try and do this. We have to decide in this world whether there will be peace if there is no justice. For Leonard Peltier, for so many communities, so many individuals. You know, it's like the efforts of these companies coming into the Dakotas. They want to take all the profits and leave us with all of the risks. And we say no. Our position is that if something needs to be challenged, we're not just going to go out there and protest it so we can feel good, like maybe that we've done something. We're going to try and figure out whatever it takes to actually make sure that that doesn't happen. It is not, KXL pipeline is not coming into South Dakota, no matter who approves it. And I don't say this as rhetoric. I say this is because we have decided this is a threat to our survival. That pipeline will cut across 2/3 of our water resources. It would cut across 3 major water resources for 3 of the larger Indian reservations in South Dakota. This can't happen. And so it won't happen. But we have to use our heads, right? Agent provocateurs are all around. There are a lot of agent provocateurs even within AIM. Create a lot of problems. Some may be still creating problems of what's left of AIM. What came out of AIM was something that's not a national movement, but a lot of people went home and doing a lot of really fine work within their communities. And teaching their kids and their grandkids so that it can continue on. So, in closing, I guess what I'd like to say before I open things up for questions, because I have no idea where I am in my outline. We got to get this man out. We really do. It's important really for all of us. Leonard is sitting in prison for all of us. We're doing nothing more than any one of us would have done if we were attacked. And our government should not be allowed to get away with framing a man because of his political activities. So, on behalf of your grandchildren and mine, I really want to thank you for your time.